when we'll be able to meet again in person. Bezrat Hashem. The day isn't too far away, I hope. But in the meantime, so we're still on Zoom, and the topic for today. So as the topic wasn't posted, but in the last email, so the sheet went out. You may have seen it. So this is an issue that we've touched upon a few years ago. I've been thinking about it a little bit more, and I've added to it a little bit. But it's a topic which I think is relevant for. I'm going to just share the screen. Relevant for both for the Parshat Shavua in terms of Bamidbar, really talk about all of Sefer Bamidbar as a whole, and the getting ready to discuss the, of course, next week in Matan Torah. So it's an idea which I think is appropriate for both of those issues. The topic that I'm going to be focusing on here is the topic of, I guess you could call it, well, we'll use the title of the sheet, namely Rabbinic Responses to Lay Laxity. In other words, basically, if you have, I'm going to make it a little bit larger for you. If you have a situation, everyone can see it? Yeah, is it on your screens? Yes, okay. So if you have a situation or situations where, let's say from a rabbinic perspective, I mean, I guess maybe from a lay perspective, it might be a little bit different, but from the, if you would say from the perspective of the Rav of a community, or maybe not just a community, the community could be all of Am Yisrael. If you're dealing with, say, let's say a body like the chief rabbinate. If you are dealing with a situation where you feel that a person or people are not acting appropriately, and you have to, or you feel that you need to make some kind of response to that breach, what kind of response should it be? Should it be a tough response? Should it be, do you take, call it teleological considerations into account? What is going to happen down the road, as it were? If you turn a blind eye to the infraction, what's going to happen down the road? If you come down too strong and perhaps drive people away from the community because of your attempt. I'm going to start actually just to give you a sense of, before I do the introduction. The introduction is really from the Sefer Bamidbar. But before I get to the introduction, I want to just give you an example of the type of question that we're going to be looking at today. I hope that we'll reach it. We should be able to reach it. At the very end, the last source that I have on the sheet. I'm not going to look at what his answer is here, but I will talk about what the question is. The question is here. This is Ravadi Yosef in the 6th section of his Yabia Omer, and Yabia Omer are his Chuvot, which are, if you will, the more detailed Chuvot than the Yechavedat. The Yechavedat is a more popular type of tshuva that are adapted from his radio addresses. This is his longer and more delineated tshuvot, and here he points out that he's already discussed this in an earlier tshuva in Chelek Daled. Here it's Chelek Vav, and he says Odot Beit Malon shemagish la'orchav harotzim bekos chalav o glida chalavit la'achar arucha b'sarit. Okay, in other words, you have a kosher hotel, and they have a meat dining room or meat kitchen and a dairy kitchen. But after the meat meal is finished, if a guest requests some dairy ice cream, they will provide the dairy ice cream in the dining room, and they, they don't check, if you will, their guests' tzitziot, and they don't care if the guest wants to keep kashrut or not keep kashrut. As long as the hotel dining room is kosher, that's all they care about. So they will bring this dairy ice cream to the guest. She'im lo yovel lishmo al machat harabanut hamekomit lahimana mikach. So the local mashgichim are not pleased with this, and the local rabbinate is trying to say that this is something that should be not only avoided, but this should be stopped. However, the question is whether or not the Rabbanut should simply cancel the hashgacha entirely. And the issue is, okay, so here you have a minor infraction, relatively speaking, and it's an infraction of specific diners, right? But should we under these conditions say, okay, we're going to have to throw, basically, I wouldn't say throw out the baby with the bathwater, but say if you're not going to be 100% in terms of your in terms of the kashrut, so then it's going to be there's no hashgacha at all. So that's the type of question that we'll be dealing with, and so this is we're going to see several very interesting tshuvot on the discussion. But first, I want to start with an introduction. An introduction at the very beginning of the sheet here deals with an overview of Sefer Bamidbar that the Netziv in his Hamek Davar has. The Netziv points out something about Sefer Bamidbar, which is a very important idea, which I think really when we are learning the Sefer, right, from now until the middle of the summer, till right before Tisha B'Av, as we go through Sefer Bamidbar, so we should be keeping this in mind. Sefer Bamidbar, I'll take what he said, and then I'll, perhaps frame it slightly differently. Zeh Sefer Nikra Bifnei HaMishnah V'od Chumash HaPikudim. Right, so the Netziv points out that the Sefer Bamidbar is known. One of the names for Sefer Bamidbar is as it is known in the translation, the Latin translation and the English translation. It's the book of Numbers. V'nirsham b'dat, and this is, by the way, this idea of calling it Numbers is not just as I said, it's not the translation per se of the church. It is a translation which is firmly rooted in an understanding of Chazal, Chumash Pikudim. Nirsham b'dat Rabbeinu inyan shnei ha'pikudim shebezeh ha'sefer. So he says, if you think about it, there are two censuses which are referred to in this in Sefer Bamidbar. There is the census at the very beginning of the Sefer, and there is the census at the end in Parshat Pinchas in Perek Chavav, and those. There is, in addition, in the census here, you have a count of the Leviim. In other words, you have 2 or 3 counts, but it's a much longer Sefer and has many, many stories in the Sefer. Why do we call it Sefer Pekudim? The truth is, even though we call it Bamidbar because of the first word, Bamidbar, or the first significant word in the Sefer, right? But that actually encapsulates it. It's the story of what happens to the Jews in the desert, the 40 years in the desert. Sefer Bamidbar is indeed the Sefer of the desert. Why call it Pikudim? Just because of these 2 incidents beyond everything else that happened. Yote misharei dvarim shemiyuchadim b'zeh sefer k'mo hameraglim u'birchat bilam v'od harbe. Think about it. There are so many different stories. The Meraglim, Korach, Bilam. Why are we focusing on the census? Mishum de'ikar zeh hasefer. So this is the Netziv's answer. Mishum de'ikar zeh hasefer hu machlif u'mishaneh halichot im Hashem b'chayei ha'olam me'az shehigiu la'eretz Yisrael min haderech shalchu bamidbar. So he says the focus of the Sefer, the focus of Sefer Bamidbar is the transition from being a people which is being guided in a very overt and open manner by God directly, to a people that is going to be guided in Eretz Yisrael behind the scenes. Shabamidbar hayu mitnahagim b'midat tiferet shahalach limin Moshe. So the Jews are leaving Mitzrayim, the idea from a Kabbalistic point, the midah of tiferet, of glory, which is accompanying the people in their trek in the desert. And that is beyond, that's the supernatural. Ube'eretz Yisrael halchu b'derech hateva. But in Eretz Yisrael, there the approach is one of going through, working with a much more natural type of approach, which is guided by God, but guided by God behind the scene. And so now the vizeh shinui hitchil odam bamidbar be'arba'im b'shnat ha'arba'im. Okay, so, and this change, he pointed out, this, if you take a look at the end of the Sefer, the Jewish people have to do much more, Bnei Israel do much more in terms of the battle against Sichon and Og, and in their discussions with the various peoples as they come closer to Eretz Yisrael, there is this transition. We'll skip a little bit. So he says, if you take a look at the census at the beginning of the Sefer and the census at the end of the Sefer, you'll see there are subtle points that point in this direction. The 2 points that he raises, one is that there is whether the way that the camp is set up, the camp is set up in the beginning of the Sefer as being a corollary to the Mishkan. It is it's moving around the Mishkan, and the one key example of this that he gives is that Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim, is given precedence over the tribe of Menashe. Ephraim is considered to be the more spiritually aware shevet, if you will, and Menashe is considered to be the more practical and pragmatic shevet. So in the first count, Ephraim is given precedence. In the second count, in Parshat Pinchas and Perek Chavav, so Menashe is given precedence. Another example that he gives is that there is here I'm going to switch the share for a second and give another share just to, I quickly put the psukim today on, whoops, I'm sorry about that, 1 second, I hit the wrong button. So just very quickly to, 1 second. Just if you take a look at the way that the psukim are written, so here, I didn't, very quickly just cut and paste. If you take a look at the way that it's stated, this is it's not in the right order. The second one is the one which is at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar. Su'u et rosh kol adat b'nei Yisrael l'mishbechotam leveit avotam b'mispar shemot kol zachar legulgulotam. It's almost a very festive type of introduction, right? Count the heads of each of the communities of Bnei Yisrael to their families, to their break them down to their households. The names of each person is important. The mispar shemot, the number, but the number of the names. Kol zachar legulgulotam. You compare that to the first pasuk with regard to the next count. Su'u et rosh kol adat b'nei Yisrael. Yes, count the heads of all of the members of Bnei Yisrael. Mi ben esrim shana v'mala lebeit avotam kol yotzei tzava b'Yisrael. In other words, basically, it's much more practically and pragmatically focused. The pragmatic need for the count happens in both, but the focus for the count is much more pragmatic in the second count. And in the first count, it's much more of an idea of the, if you will, the singularity of Bnei Yisrael and the importance of each individual in the building of the Machaneh Shechina, the Machaneh of which the Mishkan is at the heart of. Okay, there's a lot more to be said about this. I want to get into the major focus, but that's the idea. And it was basically Sefer Bamidbar is a transition. By the way, just as an aside, so when you reach David HaMelech, who's much later, and he's punished for having a census, so he basically just says there, Lech minei et Yisrael ve'et Yehuda. Go count. In other words, there is no su'u et rosh, there's no idea of the individual, there's no idea of the singularity and the importance of each person. Everyone in David's census, people have been turned into, numbers, as if you will. But the idea that Bnei Yisrael is supposed to make this transition is at the heart of the Sefer. Where does this come to a fore? So there's a single point in Parshat Bahalotcha where there is a clear transition in the Sefer. It's a pivot moment. It's a sea change even. And that sea change is the point where you have the two upside down nuns in the Sefer, to the point that Chazal even said that those two psukim are a Sefer bifnei atzmo. They are a book in of itself. Vahi bin so Aaron, vayomer Moshe, kuma, and then the next pasuk, uvnucho yomar, and when the Aaron came to arrest. And the question is, what is so important about that transition? And here, the transition is that right after those two psukim, you have the following idea. Vayihi ha'am kimit onenim. The people grumbled. The people had a yearning. This is even right before they asked for the meat. But even before then, there's a malaise. There's some kind of spiritual lacking that is almost difficult to put a finger on. And that, from that point on, for the first generation, it's all downhill. It goes from there to the Slav, and then it's going to culminate with the Meraglim, etc. But it's a question of what's the response to that? And the response to that, when you're at such a spiritual high, because after all, the Moshe is working on the supernatural level at that point. So the answer is, they get punished immediately. Later on, the kind of response is going to be very different. And the transition is going to be not the transition, but the implication is going to be a very different kind of implication in terms of how the leadership reacts and responds. You're going to have a Moshe Rabbeinu looking at a Pinchas, for example, coming out of the people itself in terms of dealing with an infraction. You're going to have the people turning to Moshe and expecting themselves to be more responsible and the like. There's a lot more to be said about this. Now is not the time, but the idea that the way that the transition is described and focuses on comes from frequently when there is, to use the title of the shir, a laxity, when there is some kind of break in what the standards should be. And how do the people respond to their own failings? How does the leadership respond? How does God respond in each of those circumstances? Sefer Bamidbar is a sefer which is the sefer, if you will, of dealing with reality. Dealing with things that come up. And things that come up can be Pesach Sheni, all of a sudden. There's people who are tamei and they want to bring the Korban Pesach and they can't. And what's the response? It can be in terms of dealing with dealing with entry into the land. Should we have spies? Shouldn't we have spies? How do we go about doing that? It can be a response of people saying that there's that of Korach, and saying that perhaps there's something wrong with the leadership, and well, what are the parameters of questioning leadership? All sorts of questions along these lines is part and parcel of Sefer Bamidbar. The Netziv feels that that's connected to the way that the count is described and what the purpose of the count is. The purpose of the count is being a corollary and a foundation for the Mishkan, or is it to be a spearhead as they go enter the land? So with that in mind, I want to try to take a look, for the next 55 minutes or so, at different approaches throughout recorded halachic history, if you will, to dealing with lacking or failings in the community, and what are the expectations of on the rabbinic side of how to deal with it. Do you bend? Do you take a very strong stance and how do you, or different approaches in between? So the first source, interestingly enough, I'm not familiar with many, if you will, primary sources in the Mishnah or the Gemara that deal with this. And in fact, the few sources that we have in Chazal are more almost semi-agadic in nature. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Let's take a look at the first source. Here's source number 2. Amar of Yosef. Zamri Gavra v'ane nashe. If you have a situation where there is some kind of singing going on, right? It's a kind of a group sing-along, and perhaps it's in a tavern setting, not totally clear, right? People singing along in a party, and if the men are singing, v'ane nashe, and the women respond, pritzuta. So that is already a break. It's pritzut. If you have this interaction between the sexes. Zamre nashi va'ane gavre, but if the women sing and the men respond, ke'esh bin oret. So that's the equivalent of fire in flax. In other words, pritzut is there's a breach. Eish bin oret means get the fire brigade out. Okay, this is out of control. Lemay nafkamina. So since neither one are going to be recommended, I mean, it's clear that the Gemara doesn't like either one. But what difference does it make whether we call it pritzus, if you will, or we call it eish b'da oret, right? It's a decon 4 or decon 5. Really, what difference does it make? In terms of our attitude towards it, they're both bad, right? So the Gemara says, "L'may nafkamina." What difference should it make? Levituleha mikameha. So the answer is, the difference is that I'm going to try to put a stop to something, one before the other. In other words, if I have a situation where I have these, it sounds as though the Gemara is willing to discuss the possibility that I'm going to have if you will, I'm going to mitigate the damage, and I'm going to be willing to accept a minor infraction or relatively minor infraction if I can put a stop to the more problematic activity. So if I can put a stop to so Rashi says, for example, the tuleha mekamehai, im ein shomin lanu levatel et shnehem, nakdim levatel et zeh shehu ke'esh bin or. Right? If the you have this practice going on in your community. You're the local rabbi. Maybe you've just come to town, and you're trying to change the spiritual footing of your community. You'd have to do it step by step. The first step that you should do is to put a stop to the zamre nashe va'ane gavre. Stop putting the women first and the men answering. Have the men sing, the women answer, and then maybe the next step you'll be able to, push it back a little further, right? Do one thing at a time, right? That's the idea. If you can put a stop to both, great. But if you can't, so focus on what seems to be the more dangerous practice, okay? That's source number one. Source number two is a following situation. And here, interestingly enough, the Gemara talks about a fallout of something. The Gemara talks about a vision that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had on his deathbed. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi on his deathbed, ki have necha nafshe de Rabbi, when Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was passing away. So, so he had an interesting type of vision or visions. Amar hamone ika bebavel kule amonei. So he says there's this family known as the Homonais, and they live in Bavel. They're all Ammonai. They all are descended from Bnei Ammon. Maskaraya ika bebavel kule de mamzerahi. Right? There's this family of the Maskaraya, and they are all mamzerim, right? There's been all their yichus has been compromised. Okay, and then we'll skip the next case. Birta de Satya Ika bebavel. Okay, there is a town that has veered in Bavel. Hayom saru me'acharei hamakom. Today, as I'm lying here in my bed, this town has moved away from God. What happened? Da'akve pera bekavre b'shabata. Va'azel bitsadu b'hu b'shabata. So they set traps for fish on Shabbat. Vishamtu Rab Achi B'Rab Yoshia. In other words, there was this community that, for whatever the reason, the way that they were not scrupulous in terms of Hilchot Shabbat, and perhaps they didn't think that it was a problem, and they set up fish traps on Shabbat, and the traps caught the fish. The local rabbinic authority, Rav Acha B'Rab Rav Yoshia, Shamtinhu. Shamtinhu is the term that the Gemara uses for putting into chayra. In other words, this group of people, perhaps Rav Achi had tried to discuss it with them and to explain to them what the problem was, and they refused to listen. But Rav Achi decided that he had to take a very strong stand. And excommunication is basically the nuclear option in the rabbinic arsenal. When you excommunicate someone or a group of people, so at least until Spinoza, so you were putting people in a situation which was untenable, right? You were cutting them off totally from a social perspective. They had no means of interacting with anyone around them. They couldn't even really interact with the outside world because, until, as I said, the modern age, and that's why Spinoza is such an important personality in this regard, until the modern period. So you're either one of us or one of them. There is no secular middle ground that you can operate in. You're either part of let's say in Europe, you're either part of the Christian world or you're part of the Jewish world. You're either part of the Muslim world or you're part of the Jewish world. You're either part of the pagan world or you're part of the Jewish world. Those are the only options depending on what the society is. Right? Being in a neutral zone of secularity just doesn't exist. And so if you excommunicate someone, so you've taken away their foundation. Right? It's not just simply being socially isolated. It's a question of being existentially isolated. That's the idea of cherem, and that's why it's such a powerful weapon, and a weapon that needs to be used very, very carefully. As I said, it's the nuclear option. Today, it's much less of an option because, you know, I put you into cherem, you put me into cherem, and who cares? Right? Because we go out and we operate in a world that really doesn't really care about whether in my local community I'm in cherem or not. Right? That's why even using cherem for situations of agunot and the like have limited impact. But at the time of the Gemara, this is, as I said, this is as severe a punishment as you can think of. In some ways, it might even be more severe than corporal punishment. And so this is what Rav Achi did. Right? He went nuclear. And what was the response of the people? Ishtamed. They became apostates. In other words, basically, when given the choice, as long as they were in the Jewish community and they were acting inappropriately, they were part of the Jewish community. Rav Achi tried to change their behavior, presumably. He was unsuccessful. So he said, okay, you don't want to play by the rules of the community, you're not part of the community. And they called his bluff. They said, okay, if we're going to be put into cherem in the Jewish community, so then we'll reject the Jewish community. Now, exactly what occurred at that moment? Did they become pagan? Did they, were they Karaites? Or, you know, this is before the actual Karaite movement, but did they go in that direction? Did they become, this is the time of the early church? Did they join one of the Christian sects that were around at the time? Not clear. But the Gemara is clear that they turned their back on us. And so this already, the Gemara is already saying here, and this is an important, you know, important enough for Yehuda Natsi to say on his deathbed, that this is occurring, right? And, you know, Rabbanim are responding, and there's a counter response on the part of the community. And sometimes, you know, the counter response has made the response, it's become basically has, you know, it's backfired, right? Or is that considered to be backfiring? Perhaps we shouldn't be concerned with it. Perhaps we should, you know, be Kantian in our philosophy and say we are people that we have our values, our core values, and we're not going to be willing to compromise on our core values. And if someone decides that because of that they aren't willing to stay within the fold, that's their decision. But we cannot compromise our values. Right? The Gemara here doesn't render a judgment. The Gemara just gives the case. The Gemara just simply says they were put into cherem, they were excommunicated, and their response was that they became apostates. The Gemara doesn't say, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? It just says it as an occurrence, period. Let's move forward a little bit, historically speaking, and now we're in the 15th century. And 15th century in Spain, this is shortly before the expulsion. The two leading rabbinic figures are the Abarbanel and Rav Yitzchak Arma. Rav Yitzchak Arma is less known than the Abarbanel. There are those who say that he influenced the Abarbanel very strongly and doesn't get due credit for it. He's most known for a sefer called the Akedat Yitzchak, which is a perush on the Torah, but it's much more than just a perush. It's he discusses all sorts of issues. He connects it loosely to the Parshat HaShavua. Now, With regard to this particular piece, a small piece, he connects this to the story of Stone, okay, and the overthrow of Stone and immorality in Stone. And here is the case that has come up to him in sometime in the mid to late 15th century in Spain, the decades shortly before the expulsion in 1492. Kama pa'amim nitchapalti al zeh. So he says, first of all, the fact that he says kama pa'amim, right? So he's saying that this is not an issue which is coming out of the blue. This is an issue which has come up time and again in the communities. So here's the issue. Odot hanashim hakideshot. So there are women who are prostitutes, okay? And these women are Jewish women, okay? You have a situation where there is a thriving, we'll call it a sex industry, in the Jewish communities, and the women are from the communities. Now, Haya Isuran Rofef Biad Shoftei Yisrael Asher B'Dorena. So, to the Isur, as you would think that this is going to be something that people are up in arms about, right? Jewish prostitution in the communities. So he says that the considering this as an Isur is Rofef Biad Shoftei Yisrael. It's something that is not being dealt with a strong hand. It's being dealt with very hesitantly in our generation. V'lo od, not only that, ela shekvar ye'otu b'ktzat ha'kehilot liten lahem chanina b'neihem. There are some communities, this is a widespread phenomenon. So in some communities, a blind eye is being turned. In other communities, it's being legalized. Latet lahem chanina. Gam yesh shemaspikin lahem pras mehakahal. There are other communities that go even further and actually are subsidizing the prostitution. Ki amru, why? Kevan shematzilot et haravakim o aschalim mechet isur ish hachamur o misakanat hagoyot. So this is actually the very similar to the argument for the, well, there are similarities. I shouldn't say very similar similarities, but to the argument for legalizing prostitution today. Basically, they're saying the following: listen, there are much worse things that are going on. In other words, if you provide the outlet, so then you're going to cut down on issues of adultery. You're going to cut down on issues of people going to non-Jewish prostitution. And it's important to add, which he mentions over here, that Mishiavolo Isur Skila Osakanat Sreifa. That if you will either have an Isur of Skila, meaning from a halachic perspective, it's if a person has relations, if a man has relations with a married woman, so that's a chiyuv mitah, that's a capital offense. If a man has relations with a prostitute, that is a lesser offense. That's not a capital offense. That is perhaps an isur of malkot. But it's not as bad, it's a lo ta'aseh, but it's not as bad as adultery. And on the other hand, if you say, well, go to the non-Jewish women, that is sakanat sreifa. Now, he doesn't say isur sreifa. He says sakana, a danger of sreifa, because in 14th and 15th century Spain, so sexual relations between a non-Jew and a Christian was a capital offense in the Spanish courts, in the Christian courts. So basically, if a Jewish man was caught with a non-Jewish prostitute, so he was risking his life. So the communities basically said, listen, we can save our members from that danger, the mortal danger of going to the non-Jewish prostitutes, or we can provide them also in terms from a spiritual perspective, a lesser sin than being involved in adultery. So this is if you will, we won't call it a positive phenomena, but it is the lesser of all of the evils. That's the argument that, based on what he's saying here, seems to be pretty widespread. Va'ani danti bazeh pamim rabot lifneihem, lifnei gedoleihem. So he's saying, I've dealt with this time and time again. This is something that keeps coming up. V'izbarti lahem, and he disagrees. And this is what a very important principle that he lays down here. Shachet hagadol asher ya'avor alav ish ish mibeit Yisrael b'seter v'shelo ledat harabim u'b'reshut beit din chatat yachidhu. Bottom line is, you know what? I agree with you. The personal offense of any given individual, if you ask me, is the offense of going to a non-Jewish prostitute worse than this? No, maybe not. Is it worse to be going to, for a person to be involved in an affair with a married woman? Absolutely. But that's his problem. That's the chet of the yachid. Every individual has to make his or her decision as to what level of observance and what level of religiosity and spirituality they're going to keep. V'hu shebe'avano yamut al yibeit din shel mala o mata. And everyone pays the consequences for their actions. Everyone has to make their decision, and you pay the price. However, omnam, go to the bold print. Hachet hakatan kishiyaskimu alav dat harabim v'hadat nitna b'batei dinehem shelo limchot bo hinehu zima v'avon plili v'chatat hakahal kulo. So, however, even if you have something which is of a lesser offense, but it's something which is being sanctioned by the community and being sanctioned by the Beit Din, so then it becomes a community which is anchored in sin. So then the only way that that there will be any abolition of this sin is if there is, God forbid, a punishment that will befall the entire community. And this is the connection that, in terms of the scriptural connection to his discussion, so that's why all of the Shevet of Binyamin in the story of the Pilegesh Begivah, that's why the entire Shevet is punished, because they knew that these kind of practices were going on and they didn't try to put a stop to it. So they bear responsibility as a community. In other words, basically, even if you have something which is a sin, which is if you will, take a look at the sin and weigh it. It's a, relatively speaking, a more minor offense, not necessarily a misdemeanor, but it's not as serious an offense as what you're trying to prevent. The community can never sanction any sin. Okay, now we have to compare this to that first case, right? The case before, where we talked about, which isn't nearly as severe as talking about questions of prostitution and questions, of course, we could have a whole shiur just on this. He doesn't seem to discuss the question of, well, what about the impact on the girls who are involved in this and all the evils of prostitution as a whole, from a societal perspective. That he doesn't seem to get into, right? He's willing to cede that argument, but he's saying it doesn't matter. Just it's the moment that this is something which is considered to be an offense, right? You don't have to say it's worse to have legalized prostitution. It could be better, if you will, from that perspective. But a community that gives sanction to any sin is a problematic community. That's his major argument. Okay, and but how does that compare to the case that we spoke earlier about in terms of what the Gemara said, that if you have two offenses, try to minimize and mitigate the damage, right? So how do you square that circle? Okay, so let's have another case. So here, we'll skip the Trumat Hadeshim for a moment because it's a time issue, and we'll deal with the following case of the Radvaz. The Radvaz says the following. He has the question. Sha'alta mimeni odiacha dati be'elu apritzim ha'ovrim averot biyad rama u'vishat nefesh. There are certain people who are quite blatant in their offenses. Ukshabayim liyaserotam, and when the Rabbanim come and try to sanction them, omrim she'amiru. So they say, listen, if you punish us, then we are going to leave the community. Now the Radvaz is speaking in the 16th century, and he's in this area of the world, right? He traveled between Turkey and Israel and Egypt, etc. Okay, so he's in this area of the Levant. And so if you're talking about Yamiru, it probably means that they're saying that they're going to become Muslim. Ha'im niyaserotam v'lo nachush Allah. In other words, do we call their bluff? Or do we do we back down? That's the question. So here's the tshuva. Kol yamai ani mitzta'er al zeh. Really very, you feel the angst in his tshuva, right? This is something that is deeply troubling to me and has bothered me for quite some time. Ki al kein tafuk Torah, right? If we give in, so then we are in effect letting Torah become diluted. Ve'ein koach lachufet harisha'im, and we don't have the force to bring the community into line and to bend the risha'im to our will. And I pray every day that my decision here will not create a breach, and that perhaps I will cause some kind of stumbling block by making the wrong decision. And then he says that, he goes on and says that you have to draw the line. But then he says, I have edited out the particulars, but he said, even though I've said that yes, you should be drawing the line, mikol makom yesh lemanhig hador liot matun b'dvarim ka'ela, lefi she'ein kol anashim shavim v'lo kol averot shavot. In other words, he's saying there is no one size fits all to this kind of decision. You're dealing with different people. You have to understand the sociology of your community. You have to understand the psychology of the individuals who are involved. You have to be dealing with lo kol ha'averot shavot. Not every sin is the same. You have to ask yourself, what kind it, or what, I shouldn't say if you don't deal with it and you ignore it, and what kind of situation will occur if you do deal with it. Haketzad, Adam shu ragil ba'averot, uvoteach ba'atzmo b'tanato, ein choshishin lo, v'yeh ma sheyeh, v'na'amid Torah. So if you're dealing with a person, he gives us an example. He says a person who is clearly a is basically is already lost. He's a person who has no sense of responsibility to the community. He's going to do whatever he wants regardless. So then he says that kind of person, you really have very little to lose by standing up to him. If he walks away, he walks away. But if you give in, you're going to let him be setting the standard for everyone else. But if right? So, but if on the other hand, you're dealing with a person who's wavering, and your sense is that if you come down too harshly, it will backfire for all practical purposes. So then you should tread very, very lightly. Hakol lefi ra'ot einei hadayan hamanhig ubilvad shiu kol va'asav l'shem shamayim. Right? Every person has to judge his own community and make the call. Right? Basically, he's also telling the questioner that I'm not going to take the flak for your decision here. You have to make the decision. Right? This is I'm going to give you the guidelines, but you have to decide how you're going to apply it, and everything, has to be done l'shem shamayim, and you have to also be very, very cognizant of the fact, you, the posek, that your actions, right, are going to reverberate here. It's not simply a question of deciding whether the pot is treif or not. Right, that you're dealing here with a situation which can have effects which go far beyond this particular case. Here's another example of the same idea. This is something which troubles poskim throughout the generations. Shulchan Aruch says the following: Siman Lamed Daled. The ha'over al davar isur minadin oto la'altar. So if somebody who violates Isurim, so we put him into Cherem immediately. Haga, the Ramah, right? So this is now 16th century, by the way, mid 16th century. The Rav Yosef Karo here in Tzfat, the Ramah in Krakow. Uminadin lemishu chayav nidui. Va'afilu yesh lachush she'al yedei ken yetzei letarbut ra'ah en lachush bekach. In other words, if you will, the standard halacha, both in the Sephardic world and in the Ashkenazic world, is that you put a person into nidui. Again, that's excommunication. You will put someone into cherem, and you don't have to worry about the person. Ein lachush. You don't have to worry that this person may go off the derech, as it were, right? This is something, leave the fold. You have to do what's right, right? That's, if you will, if you're saying, what's the halacha? So that's the Shulchan Aruch, that's the Ramah. On these words, the Taz, who is a generation and a half later in Poland, so he says the following: Tmiya li hai milta tuva. He's in the early first half of the 17th century. Tmiya li hai milta tuva. The heich nachush li isur she'oseh v'naviei l'dei tarbut ra'ah chas v'shalom. So he says, I just don't get the Ramah. What is the risk and benefit ratio here? Right? How can you possibly say that we are going to be concerned about this particular isser that he's over? Right? He's violated something. So don't give him maftir yona. Okay, but to put him into cherem, if you think, in other words, if you go with the nuclear option, so this person will leave the community. Right? By the way, I mean, it's still, things are different from a sociological perspective. in Poland and in Holland, but this is about the same time as Spinoza. So here, the Taz is sensitive to it. The Shach, who is a younger contemporary of the Taz, Shabtai Rappaport, is also in Poland, and is in the mid 17th century. So he, in his commentary or his super commentary to the Taz, the Nekudat HaKesef, so he quotes this Taz, number 10. Taz hikshe al harama, v'yesh lidchot kol rayotav. The Taz attacks the Rama, but one can push aside all of his points. Dahacha kevan dedin beit din hu shemenadin otan ein lachush di'im lo ken but la din b'Yisrael. In other words, here you have this idea saying, listen, we have to call it the way we see it. And if we see it as being an Isur which has this penalty, you don't blink. You have to go ahead and do what needs to be done. Because if I guess you could say this is the slippery slope argument. If you don't draw the line, Batla din Yisrael. So then you're going to be run roughshod over. You have to take a stand and let the chips fall where they may. And that's what you have to do, because the alternative is worse. If you're concerned that any given person is going to leave the flock because of your actions, so then basically you have no power. Now, this is taken to an extreme, I think, by the Chatam Sofer. Chatam Sofer now we're moving forward historically. We're now in the 19th century. And the Chatam Sofer dealing with, by the way, also keeping in mind that he is dealing with reform, and as many of you are aware, he is one of the strongest opponents of reform, and as opposed to, let's say, an earlier contemporary of his, the Noda Yehuda, who is more willing to be open to certain changes. The Chatam Sofer famously, maybe even too famously, because it makes his personality too stereotyped. But the famous quip that he has, that Chadash Asur min Torah, right? Anything new is Asur from the Torah. So here's his particular situation. The question that was raised to him is dealing with a situation where you are worrying about collateral damage. Until now, what we've been discussing is dealing with the person himself, and perhaps the if you will, the sinner will face either face serious consequences. That's the case of the Akedat Yitzchak, or the sinner will turn his back to the community. But what about the collateral damage? Because it's not only the sinner, it's also his family. Right? Even the first concentric circle that you have to look at is the family. And those people, his wife, his children, are not necessarily sinners. Certainly the children aren't. And if you excommunicate a person, you're excommunicating the family for all practical purposes, and you're going to be punishing them. So should that be a factor? So he says, Sarvan va'arvayan ba'al maman le'malan shelo nachush al banav sheyeh tzadikim ve'ech negarshem mehistapech minachlat Hashem. How can we chase them away from being, let's say, a quote from the Tanakh, or a paraphrase, how can we chase them from being inheriting their portion in the portion of God? And now he quotes an earlier source, the Maharshal, who is a contemporary of the Rama, also in Poland, and the Rav Shlomo Luria, the Yam Shel Shlomo, very influential person. So he says the following: He sigal tshuvat Rav Paltoy Gaon. So there is a tshuva of the Gaonim going back to the 9th century that the Maharshal in the 16th century, 700 years later, takes issue with. Sheyesh ligzor al eshet hamuchram shelo lechlech lebeit hakneset ulegaresh bana mi beit hasefer. So the Gaon, Rav Paltoi Gaon, dealing with this particular situation, said that not only should the offender be punished, but his wife should be banned from coming to shul. Of course, he didn't call it shul because he was in Bavel, but banned from coming to the Bet Knesset, and also to stop his children from coming to school. In other words, we're going to put maximum psychological pressure on this person by hitting not only him, by hitting his family as well. That was the Gaon's position. The Katav, and the Maharshal, 700 years later, writes, Chalila, God forbid, b'meshek kol ha'olam eino mitkayem ever behevel tinokot shel beit Rabban. There is nothing more important to Jewish continuity than children being in school. You don't deal with your issue by hitting your own future. You can't do such a thing. And not only with regard to the children, but also with regard to the wife. Masha katav lo tzi ishto mi bet hakneset im hu chata, hi ma chata. Right? How can you have collateral damage? That is, she hasn't sinned in any way. Why should she suffer? Why should she be put into social isolation just because her husband has run afoul of the law? You want to punish him, punish him. But to punish innocent victims, people who are the innocent bystanders, no. That's the Maharshal's position. Now, you listen to the Chtam Sofer, again, writing a couple of hundred years later after the Maharshal. So he's more removed, historically speaking, from the Maharshal than we are removed from the Chtam Sofer, just to put it into perspective, okay? But he's writing the following. Yesh li yashev divrei hagaon. He's going to come to the defense, of the Gaon. And he says, he brings a source that allows for this, but he says, Al-Kain, aleinu levatla mi beit ha-sefer ulegaresh ishto mi beit ha-knesset shelo yeh lo laharasha shum zchut ha-mesaya. Was we don't want this Rasha to have any positive point in his favor. After all, his wife is the tzaddiket who goes to shul maybe even every day. His children are the star pupils in the school. So he's getting zchuyot. We don't want him to have any zchuyot. We want him to be brought down. And he says, Mikol makom, what about the children? What about the wife? Ein b'zeh shum hefsed lebanav u'lishto. V'gam l'kiyum ha'olam ha'omed al hevel tinokot shel beit Rabban. Don't worry about that. Why? Dekol ha'mechashev la'asot mitzvah v'ne'anas v'lo asa ma'aleh ha'katuv ki'ilu asa'o nimtzu schar ha'isha v'habanim v'shel kol ha'olam mamash kol chach. No, it basically says, listen, it's okay. The children, the wife, the scorekeeper in the sky, as it were, isn't going to hold this against them. They're going to continue to have their zchuyot because they want to do the mitzvot. They're just not allowed to do the mitzvot. There's a barrier that we're placing in their path. So that is going to not be held against them in the court b'shamayim. Right? Very, very, very radical statement in terms of his idea. No, basically he's saying we have to cut out whatever evil as we see it, and whatever price we have to pay, we'll pay it. he does draw the line on one thing. He says, "Mikol makom yesh ladun b'didon didan sheyesh lanu lachush al banim ktanim debahad lo shayach lomar shelo yafsidu im yitmeu ben hanochrim chas v'shalom." So he says, listen, there is another aspect that I have to take into account. The aspect I have to take into account is that, God forbid, the children who are now going to be taken from school, from the cheder, and they're going to be put into a Catholic school. So these children are going to, and this is what's beginning to happen in his lifetime. He's a contemporary of Mendelssohn, so he's a slightly younger contemporary. So he's basically saying, you're going to have a situation where the children perhaps will convert to Christianity. They're going to convert to Christianity, so then maybe I'm willing to draw the line if you're afraid of that going to happen. In other words, if the risk is that they're going to leave the fold entirely, so then maybe it's not worth it, right? So but his basic position is that if this is the din, this is the din. So I want to very quickly, in the few minutes that are left to me, look at a few tshuvot of Rav Moshe Feinstein, where he, in a different kind of milieu, in the mid 20th century, mid to late 20th century, he's dealing with the issues that are facing communities in the modern Western world. I don't have time to go through all three of them right now. I'm just going to take an example here. So he says with regard to, and you can see the line that he draws. Okay, here is the two cases that we're going to deal with. One, as you can see, it's dated in 1963, Tafshin Chaf Gimel. Here's the shaila. Hinei b'dvar cheder hanikra ulam misibot, social hall. Okay, so we're talking about a social hall in the shul. Shenivneh gam ke'dachad gag echad im cheder shenityached lebeit hakneset להתפלל שם. פשוט שאין עליו שם קדושה ומותרים לעשות שם דברי חול. So first of all, he just says from a halachic perspective, you shouldn't think that this has any kedusha. You can have parties. You can have whatever affairs in the that you'd like in the social hall. L'sachek b'klafim. However, how about card playing? Ubingo, uchidome. Right. So you're going to have bingo and cards, etc. Poker parties. The socials getting along. Remember, it's the early 60s, and you think about what the social halls of shuls are like in various American communities. So he says, bingo isn't exactly asur. Barur hem dvarim mechuarim b'chol makom shahel. V'gam hu k'moshav leitzim. So this is something that you shouldn't be too keen on as a rabbi to be having in your community. Uvidvar rikudim. However, with regard to dances, right? This is an Orthodox shul. And so now they have a social gathering where the shul is sponsoring a mixer in the community. And part of the mixer is going to be mixed dancing. Bachurim uptulot v'tarovo hu davar ha'asur. However, if you're talking about sponsoring a mixed dance in your shul, right? So this is something that, I don't think of any Orthodox shul today would even begin to think about, but this is the reality in the 1960s when the conservative movement is ascendant, and the assumption is that the future of Judaism is with the conservative movement and the reform movement, and Orthodoxy is fighting a rearguard action. So now Orthodoxy doesn't want to lose anyone. So you're going to have these mixers in the shul. So he says it's asur, and he points out the halachot, the halachic problematic nature of mixed dancing. V'lo shayach lahatir ze gam lefi tanat achadim shem lo yisteru lehem rikudim b'social hall yelchu lamakom shemiuchad meha'ir l'raked sham. They say, listen, we have our youth, right? If we have this activity, they'll have their dances in the community. They'll stay within the community. They'll marry within the community. If you don't have the social outlet in the community, they'll go elsewhere. And that's much worse. He says, no, that's a line you can't draw, that you have to draw. You cannot, this is along the lines of the Akedat Yitzchak, obviously. I'll leave it to the participants of the shir to decide whether the legal prostitution issues of the Akedat Yitzchak or the mixed dancing issues of Rav Moshe, which one is worse. But it's a similar type of question in this regard. So he's saying this is something that the community can't sanction. If the community sanctions it, it becomes problematic. And the fact that they're going to do that, that's their problem, right? If this is something, if they decide that that's what they're going to do, that's their decision. That's not the Tzibur's decision. But if we, in your community, you make the arrangements to allow for it, not only to allow for it, but to provide the services for it, so you are actively abetting the Aveira, and that's a line that you can't do. Right? That's a very important point that he's making, that you cannot be the facilitator for an Aveira, even if the Aveira, relatively speaking, is the lesser of the evils that are involved. Very similar in this regard to the psak of the Akedat Yitzchak, which preceded him by about 500 years. An earlier tshuva, which number 14 here, where he says the following: it's a tshuva that's sent to Mexico City, and there the Jewish community has just put up Dvar HaSports Center, Yehudi Sheniftach Mexico. Okay, so you have the local JCC has put together a Jewish community. The federation has a sports center. Asher mevashlim sham nevelot v'trefot l'shkatzim v'ramashim, but it's not kosher. The Jewish community center, which is not kosher, uchvot tarato yachol lif'ol shiachshivu hamakom. So the Av Beitin can, in the community, can influence, he's able to stop it in the sense that he can make sure that the community center becomes a kosher institution. However, there's a condition. Tanai she'anichu otam liten l'mi she'rotze lishtot chalav v'glida kara hanaset mechalav achar aruchat basar. Right? The condition is we will make sure that the kitchens and the dining rooms are kosher. Everything is kosher. But we are not going to be mashgichim for the practices of the individual members. If they want to be eating ice cream after a meat meal, we'll provide the ice cream for them. We're not going to tell them, no, you're fleishik now. You can't have the challah. That's the condition. Right, and then presumably it's the same dining room. It's not that somebody's getting up from the meat dining room and walking into the dairy dining room. It's that at the table they will be given, in the dairy dishes, they'll be given the dairy food. So is that a line that you're going to do? Because basically you're knowing that you are allowing for this kind of behavior. So he says, no, this he believes is a line that should not be crossed, that can be crossed. It says, "Harei ein hashgacha v'hechsher ha'banim al hanashim hamochrim lahid she'em tzadikim." What's a hashgacha? Hashgacha is not trying to tell people that the people who are partaking of the food are tzadikim or not, right? Everyone knows that there are people who are observant. There are people who aren't observant. אלא שרבנים יראו וישגיחו על המקום שהדברים שמוכרים שם יהיו דברים כשרים שימכרו לאוכלים רק באכלי בשר כשר. So he says, this is the type of thing that you have to make sure that for the person who wants to have kosher, and for the community, you will create a situation where people can keep kosher. In other words, the difference between this case and the previous case is whether are you the facilitator or are you the observer who is turning a blind eye. To be a facilitator, that you can never be a facilitator. To be a facilitator of Aveira, even if you think that by doing so you're preventing a greater evil, you still can't facilitate Isurim. That's a line that you can't cross. To create a situation where you are lessening the Isur which exists, and you are, as a result, allowing people to have a choice, even though you know that some people will make the wrong choice from our perspective, that is a line that you can cross and you can allow. So he says that in this particular case, you can have the hashkacha. It's just that you have to make it clear that that what you are. He continues and he says that it has to be very clearly marked in the what the hashkacha is applying to, what the hashkacha is not applying to. Again, so that people shouldn't come to the conclusion that the Rabbanim are allowing for a particular practice. Similarly, by the way, this was getting back to that first tshuva, and with this I'll close because I'm already I'm over time now. Is that with regard to the hotel that the Ravadia was dealing with, he says very similarly to Rav Moshe. Nira shebenidona kashrut v'hashkacha b'batei malon bizman hazeh ein safek klal shebevadai tzarich lahamshich hashkacha v'hakashrut. You should definitely not rescind the hashkacha because they are giving the ice cream to the patrons of the hotel. Shaharei hadavar mefursam shetayarim rabim haolim michutz laaretz mitachznim b'batei malon elu. Right? Halabai Bezrat Hashem will get back to this, where the hotels are full. Ve'ein lahem makom acher laharacha. You have tourists; they're coming, and they expect or they understand that the hotel is kosher. And if you rescind the hashkacha, so then people who aren't looking all that carefully, but want a kosher hotel, will come to the hotel, assume that it's kosher. They'll be told by the proprietors that yes, all the ingredients are kosher, or they might not even ask the question, they'll assume everything is kosher. And it won't be kosher anymore because the Rabbanut walked out. So here again, you don't have to go and stop every infraction that might be going on in the premises. That's not your role. Your role is to provide a hashkacha for those people who are interested, and to make sure that that there aren't people who will inadvertently eat non-kosher because they are assuming that the premises are kosher when it no longer is because the Rabbanut left. And he says, however, I'm aware that there are people who disagree with me. Ra'iti liyedidi nafshi, to my beloved friend Rav Oldenburg, and shehala sheyesh lahasir ashkacha mitzad harabanut. So he was of the opinion that you should remove the hashkacha, right? So it's not a open and shut case even today, as many of you may be familiar with. This question still keeps coming up. Va'ani al mishmarti amoda, but Rav Ovadia is not one to back down, and he says no, and I'm willing to stand my ground on this one, but I understand that there is the dissenting opinion. So basically, right, through the generations up to this very day, and new questions come up all the time. These type of issues are very much a part of our scene, and the question of how to be dealing with a lack um, of, of scrupulousness in terms of keeping mitzvot. Should we be coming down hard? Should we coming down with a more bending type of response? So I just want to finish where we began earlier, namely with the idea of the Radvaz. Kol yamai ani mitzta'er al zeh. This is something which is so terribly difficult to come to strike the right balance. And hakol lefi ra'ot einei hadayan hamanhig u'vad shiyu kol ma'asav l'shem shamayim. Okay, it was wonderful being able to be with you again, and look forward to being able to have the shiur in person very soon.
Amen. Scott.
Shabbat shalom.
Okay, kol tov, Shabbat shalom.